Okay, let's go ahead and get started here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jennifer Hodgdon, also known as Jay Hodgdon, and I've been involved in the Drupal project for just about 8 years, I guess. And I do a lot of stuff with documentation, especially API documentation, and I've been involved in a bunch of different things with Drupal 8. Like for some random reason, I got involved in the Drupal 8 multilingual initiative, reviewing all of the views-related patches. So I have kind of varied interests, and I'm also the maintainer of the core search module for some strange reason, and I have a few contrib modules. And the exciting new thing about Drupal 8 that if you didn't hear, we're going to make a user manual for Drupal for the first time for Drupal 8.
Wow.
Oh yeah, you didn't hear. So this is an exciting announcement. We just decided to do this, we being me and the members of the documentation working group within the Drupal project. We decided to do this just a few weeks ago and posted on groups.drupal.org. This has nothing to do with my talk, by the way, but oh well. We posted on groups.drupal.org a notice that we were thinking about doing this, a proposal. And we got about 100 comments from the community, all very positive with some good suggestions, and about 25 or 30 people volunteered to help, which was an amazing outpouring of support for something that I've been involved in the documentation leadership in the Drupal project for nearly the whole time I've been involved in Drupal, about 7 years. And we've made similar proposals a number of times before, have been met with basically hostility from the community. So this was a big change, and we're very excited. So we're going to actually launch this at the Sprint tomorrow. Joe Schindler, who's another member of the Docs working group, is here, and we've been working on getting together instructions and guidelines and an outline, which isn't quite ready, but the instructions and guidelines are. We'll have the outline by tomorrow, I assure you. Some part of the outline anyway. And the idea is that the members of the community can write the topics, and we'll get them. We'll have writers, reviewers, and testers, so just about anybody can help. So if you're undecided about coming to the Sprint tomorrow because maybe you're not a hardcore coder or whatever, come anyway because you can write some help files, documentation for people, and we'll have a user manual for Drupal 8 with the objective of new users being able to learn Drupal rather than like going to a 2,000-page mess of spaghetti that's the community documentation. They'll have a 50-page manual that they could read and actually know what they need to know, and then be ready to go do Google searches to find out the other stuff. So that's our objective. Has nothing to do with my talk, but I'm really excited about it, so I wanted to talk about it anyway. Yeah, and it's just so gratifying that the community's finally gotten behind it, because documentation is one of those things that in every single survey that people do about what's wrong, oh, I forgot to push the red button after all that. Anyway, every single survey that people do about what's wrong with Drupal, documentation comes up as the #1 problem. And the main thing is that new users just feel completely overwhelmed by the amount of documentation, and they don't have a clue where to start, so we're trying to address that. So anyway, that has nothing to do with my talk, which is probably okay since I forgot to hit the record button anyway. So I'm actually going to talk today about Drupal 8, a new concept for Drupal 8 that's called services, or dependency injection, or containers. And you may have heard these terms and kind of thought, oh my gosh, what is that? So I was thinking about lions and tigers and bears. So anyway, the name of this talk is Services, Dependency Injection, and Containers. Oh my. And you can just picture, Dorothy walking through the woods with the cowardly lion and all of that, lions and tigers and bears. And we'll get into that. So let's start with this question of what is a service and why do we have them in Drupal 8. So the service concept was adopted from the Symfony project, and you may have heard about Symfony. So in Drupal 8, the big change in philosophy in Drupal 8 from Drupal 7 was this idea of, well, rather than inventing everything ourselves, we might want to just try to use some good software from other projects. And we're already doing that with things like jQuery, which everybody knows you should use jQuery rather than writing all of your JavaScript from scratch and stuff like that. But we weren't doing that so much with the PHP code in Drupal. And so the project looked around for web frameworks. And so what does Drupal do? It does websites, it does web requests, and there's this Symfony framework out there for doing web requests, and so we kind of adopted the Symfony framework, and along with that came some other concepts that we had a choice of adopting or not, and one of them was services. And the basic idea of services is that kind of goes along with the idea of hooks from previous versions of Drupal. So you want to make Drupal core adaptable so that modules can implement hooks or do other things to modify the core behavior of Drupal or add to the core behavior of Drupal. And so in Drupal 7, if you wanted to modify how something was looking, then you would do a theming kind of thing, and those were theme hooks. And if you wanted to modify how search was being implemented, there were some hooks that would modify the search behavior. And there are all kinds of, there's thousands of hooks, or hundreds anyway, I'm not sure exactly how many, but there are a lot of hooks in Drupal 7. And in Drupal 8, we kind of split off the concept of hooks into several different types of things that you could modify, and one of them is called services. So services are like the core building blocks of what Drupal does. So each service is one chunk of that functionality, such as like translating the user interface, or caching some kind of data, or doing path aliases. And the idea is that Drupal core defines what the core services are, and modules can define other services as well. We'll get into that. And the idea is that Drupal core would define what the services are and also provide a default class for each service. And then a module, a contributed module, could override that service by providing its own class. And so it allows even these really fundamental building blocks of Drupal core to be overridden by just installing a module. So that's the basic idea. And again, we had the ability in Drupal 7 to do things like this with various hooks. But in Drupal 8, it's kind of like, well, Drupal core says we should do this with this class, and I can install this module that says, no, let's use my class instead. And so you can change it by just swapping out the class that's doing that service. And usually you'd extend the class, but we'll get into that. Okay? Everybody clear on what the basic idea is? Oh, I love being interrupted when I give talks. Some people don't like being interrupted, but I really love being interrupted. So if you have a question, please do not save it for the end because you'll probably forget it by then. So yes?
We touch on services and contributed modules.
Services like services that contributed modules define?
Yes.
We will touch on how to do that, but I don't think I'm going to touch on any particular services that contributed modules provide.
That's fine.
Okay. Yeah, we will get into that. So, so anyway, please do, if you have any questions, even, the idea, I realized when I was in college a long time ago, that if I had some question and I was brave enough to ask the question, usually like half the class was happy that I did that because they were just too shy to ask the question. So keep that in mind. There aren't too many people in here, and they're all pretty friendly. So and nobody's going to think less of you for asking a question. There are no dumb questions. So so just if you have a question, please just ask it. Okay, so let's talk about how you define a service. So a service definition. What does a service definition include? It has a machine name. Everything in Drupal has machine names. So examples of machine names for services are string underscore translation. You can guess that that's the string translation service for the user interface strings. Cache.default. And there are a bunch of other cache.something else services as well that are services for caching a particular type of data, or a particular cache bin of data. And then path.alias underscore manager, and of course that's the manager for the path aliases. Those are the three services I mentioned in the last slide. So, the machine names exist. The second thing a definition includes is kind of implicit, but it's an interface that defines what the service does, a PHP interface definition. So you don't actually have to do that, but it's a really good idea because if someone does want to override your service and you don't have an interface, you haven't really defined what the service needs to provide. And so they're going to be forced to override your class even if they don't really want to. And just writing an interface is also just a very good practice to make sure that you have if you can define what your service does, if you can't define what it does by writing an interface, you probably don't have a service. It's kind of nebulous, so you should define an interface. Obviously, you need a default class to provide the service, which should implement your interface. And then some services have tags, which we'll talk about. Some of them depend on other services, and some have what are called factory classes. Rather than defining just one class, you define a way to instantiate the correct class. And the caching services are examples of that. We'll get into that a little bit, I think. Did I talk about that? Anyway, some of them do have factories. And if you're not familiar with factories, that's kind of a standard object-oriented thing where you have one class that instantiates other classes. Yes?
So it's like one way to think of an interface that's like an API documentation
yes.
for your service. Like,
right.
here's what the different
methods are and
right. properties, and here's what they
right.
do.
So for instance, the string translation service does have an interface, and the methods on it are, kind of a T, like the T function that translates text, the format plural, the translate, I guess it's format plural that translates plural forms. So like you could say 1 dog, 2 dogs, that has both of those forms in it. And those are the two main functions for the string translation service interface. So it's a way to define, here are the methods that you can call on a service. Yeah.
Just if you had an example handy, or maybe not.
We will be getting into the examples. Yeah. So here's an example. I love it when people lead into questions that are in the next slide. So when you actually go about defining a service, can you guys see the text? Is it big enough up there? Okay. When you actually go about defining a service, you're going to put the definition into a services.yml file. And so there's a file called in the core folder, core directory of Drupal 8. There's a file called core/core.services.yml, and that has like 50,000 lines in it, and it defines all of the core services that aren't part of specific modules. And then within each module directory, you could have, like in the search module, there could be a search.services.yaml file, and that would define services that are particular to that module and are only active if that module is turned on. So I don't remember if the search module has a services file, but anyway, a lot of the core modules do have a specific services.yaml file in them as well. And if you're not familiar with YAML, this YML format, as you get to be programming in Drupal 8, you will become familiar with YAML. But it's a pretty simple syntax. It uses indentation and things to kind of just define a structure, like a kind of like a, either you could think of it as it's kind of like a nested array, a nested associative array in PHP, but anyway, it's pretty easy to understand. So at the top of the, oops, sorry. No, don't do this to me. Okay. At the top of the services.yaml file, there's a line that says services : that says, oh, I'm going to define a bunch of services, and there might be another thing right above that. In the core services file, there's now a couple lines above that, but don't worry about that right now. And then each section, like this one that starts path, shoot. I guess I can't highlight stuff with my mouse when I'm in this mode, right? So each section, like the path.alias manager and cache.default, defines, the next level of hierarchy is each one is defining an individual service. And then within that, you can see that there's a class defined. That's the default class for that service. And then some arguments, which we'll get into. This cache service has a tag and a factory, which I was talking about. So, all the different pieces that go into the definition go underneath the machine name in the hierarchy. So basically, to define a service, the two steps are going to be to put the entry into your services.yaml file, and then you'll have to define this class or factory to actually do the service. And generally, you also want to make that class implement an interface that you define so that if somebody could override it, just to make it definite what they need to override. Okay? But the interface does not go into the services.yaml file. It's all implicit, and so you should probably, if you make a service class, you should probably put something in your class header, because your service could, in principle, implement several interfaces, because you can do that in PHP, but you should probably put something in your class header documentation that says, if you need to override this service, make sure you implement this interface, and then people will really know what that interface is, because there's no real way in the services YAML file to say, this is the interface, these are the 5 methods you need, or the 2 methods you need, or the 1, or whatever it is. Okay. Yes?
I guess I'm a little confused if you don't reference the interface, but like right there, for cache default, it says cache backend interface.
Oh, well, that's because this is a factory class, a factory type of service. So I don't think it does. It's true that does have the interface in there, but I'm not sure that Symfony actually cares about that. I think the fact that it says factory is going to take precedence over that. So yeah, the factory services are a little bit different from the regular ones.
Are you going to talk a little bit more about factories?
I don't remember if I put something in the talk about this. This is a talk I gave a while back, and I refreshed it about a week ago, and then I've been just absorbed in my user manual thing, so don't remember if I talked about factories, but we could talk about it afterwards if we can get to it.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So now that you've defined, core defines at least 100 services, I'm pretty sure. I think way more than that. And then once you've defined all the services, how does this actually work? And the key enabling concept for services is that anytime you use that functionality, instead of just instantiating the class yourself, you need to get the services from this thing that's called the dependency injection container, which is the other mysterious term that you may have seen around. So the reason you have to do that is the dependency injection part of the container. So there's this thing called the container, which is this concept from Symfony. And I don't know why it's called the container. It's kind of a weird name, but anyway, it's called the container. But the dependency injection part is the fact that that services can depend on each other, and that each one can be overridden independently by some other module. And so you have to get, when you want to instantiate a service, you have to ask for it from the container so that you get the correct overridden chain of services that depend on services that depend on services from Drupal, rather than just instantiating the class yourself and passing in some dependencies that aren't the right ones. Okay? And I will go a little bit more into that. But there are 2 ways to get classes from the dependency injection container. And one of them is called service location, which is kind of an adequate way to do it. And the other one is called dependency injection, which is the preferred way to do it. And we're going to get into what those 2 terms mean. But you need to make sure that whenever you use a service like string translation or whatever, path generation, you need to make sure to use the service properly and not just, oh, I found this class. I'm going to just, do new that class in PHP, which is a legal thing to do in PHP, but it's a bad thing to do in Drupal, because you're not going to get all of the information in there that you need. Okay. So this is how you do the easy method of getting a service, which is called service location. So if you have some procedural code that's not in a class, you can get a service class by using this magic/Drupal class. Have you guys seen this /Drupal class before? Okay, so there's a new class in Drupal, and it's at the very, very top level of the namespace hierarchy. Have you guys seen the namespace stuff? I don't know how much Drupal 8 stuff you've been doing. Okay, so Drupal 8 uses namespaces. You'll have to look up the PHP concept, but the idea is that classes don't have to have completely unique names like they kind of did in older versions of PHP and older versions of Drupal. But now you can have multiple classes with the same name, but they have these namespace prefixes on them. But at the top level of the Drupal hierarchy of namespaces is this class called Drupal, which is just in the top level namespace. And this /Drupal class, you should go look it up on api.drupal.org. It has all kinds of interesting methods. And one of them is a method called service, which will, if you pass in the service name, it will get you a class of that service. Okay? And then the Drupal class also has some particular methods for getting really commonly used services, like the Drupal cache method, which you can also pass in the name of a particular cache subset, like the block cache or whatever. There's a lock service that has a lock method. The query service for doing entity queries has an entity query method. And then the config service is another one that has a particular method in the Drupal class. So if you call like Drupal : config, it's equivalent to calling /Drupal : service with config.manager as the service name. It's just kind of a little shortcut method. So these methods down here are the same as calling these the generic method up here. And then if you're in a class that has a $container variable, or in a method that has a $container variable in it, and that $container variable always points to the dependency injection container, then you can call this get method on the container, passing in the service name. And that's actually what the Drupal service method does, is it gets its own container, which is a class variable, and then calls get on it. So you can look at the code. It's like 3 lines. Okay? So you're going to see a lot of code around that has a $container variable, and if you have a $container variable, it's always the service, the dependency injection container, and if you need some service, you can always call that get method on it. Okay? Yeah?
Is there an advantage of using the container versus the Drupal service?
Well, the advantage is that you've already got the container, so if you call /Drupal, it has to get its container variable, and if you've got a method that already has the container variable in it, then you can just use that. It just saves a minimal amount of code. But they do the exact same thing. Yeah. Okay. So moving on. The other way to get services is a little bit more several orders of magnitude more complicated, and that's called dependency injection. But dependency injection is what is used in classes for getting services. So there are 2 ways to do dependency injection. The first is that if your class that you need, your class is itself a service. So you are defining service A, and it depends on services B, C, and D. You inject the services that it depends on through the services.yaml file. And the way you do that is that in the services YAML file, there's this section that says arguments, which you might have seen in the other example, and I kind of glossed over. But this says, my service depends on the path alias storage, the path alias whitelist, the language manager, and the cache data. This is the arguments for the path alias generator service. It depends on all these other services. And so what happens is that when you put that arguments thing into your YAML file, in your constructor, all of those services classes will get instantiated magically by the back end of Drupal and Symfony and all of that stuff, and passed into your constructor as fully realized classes, and you don't have to do anything else. So all you have to do then in your constructor is just declare that alias, that you need storage, and it's going to get the path alias storage service, instantiate it, and pass it in. And then if, here you've declared that you need whitelist, and Drupal's going to find the path alias whitelist service, instantiate it, and pass that in. So it's just going to get all those things for you. And then in your constructor function, you're going to just save those on member variables in your class, and then you can use them in other methods on your class. Okay? So that's sort of a magic thing, but it's just, you have this shorthand that says, in your services.yaml file, it says, these are the services I need, and then they just magically get passed into your constructor when you construct the class by going through service, the accepted service methods. And this is why you can't just sort of instantiate one of these services, because where would you get all these classes from? Well, you'd have to figure out how to instantiate them, but it's better to just call the dependency injection container and say, you figure it out, because this service might depend on 2 or 3 other services, and this one might too, and they all have other different arguments, and so you really do just want to call that /Drupal get, or the container methods to get the services, because it's really complicated to instantiate these things. Okay, so this is the dependency part of dependency injection, because these are the dependencies. They're services that are dependencies of my service. And you're injecting them into your service magically into the constructor by just putting them in the YAML file. That's the injection part of dependency injection. Okay.
In your class, do you still need a use statement at the top?
Yeah.
For those
Yes.
services and the documentation?
Well, but you're going to just use these interfaces, right? You're going to just say use alias storage interface, but really what's going to come in is an instantiated class. But yeah, the use statement is just for PHP to know what the namespace is of all of these classes you define. And the reason that Drupal 8 has all those use statements and Drupal 7 didn't is because we didn't use namespaces in Drupal 7. And so if you, we had this, let me just digress for a minute about class loading, okay? So the reason we're using namespaces now is about class loading. In Drupal 7, if you wanted a PHP class to get loaded by your module, then you had to put the include file in your files, in the files section of your module.info file, right? Do you remember doing this? So if you had a class and you wanted it to get loaded, you put it in the files section, and then Drupal would have this proprietary, written with Drupal class loader thing that said it at the time when you cleared the cache, or probably maybe it was a little less often, but anyway, at some point Drupal would build this registry. It would read all those include files that were in your module.info file, figure out what classes were defined there, and store a list. And then if somebody asked for that class, it would magically go find the list that it had cached and include that include file, and PHP would be happy. Okay. In Drupal 8, we don't do that. We're using Symfony, Doctrine. Anyway, one of these frameworks that we adopted had a class loader in it, and I don't think it was Symfony itself. I think it was Doctrine or something else. But anyway, one of the frameworks we adopted had a class loader in it that works with namespaces. So PHP version 5.4 has namespaces. I think it's 5.4 where they came in. And what the namespace idea is that you're going to put your class files in particular directories that correspond to the namespaces. So if you look at the Drupal core, hold on, I will show you. Can you guys see this, or is it too small? Okay. Okay. So if you go into your, this is just my Git repository, you can guess, this is my Git repository for the Drupal project. If you go into the core live Drupal directory under Drupal 8, you'll see that there is component and there is core. And if you look at core, you'll see that there are all these directories and files. The directories are in blue and the files are in black on there, if you are not colorblind. But this, let's look at this link.php file. That has a class in it whose name is link, and it's in the Drupal core namespace. Because of where it is in the directory structure, it is in that Drupal core namespace. So if we look at that file, you'll see that there's a namespace. Hold on, let me just move this over just slightly. There's a namespace declaration at the top of that file that says it is in the Drupal core namespace, and that's also where it is in the directory structure. So with the class loader that's used in Drupal 8 knows about the Drupal class structure, and it will automatically load a class if some other file references Drupal core link with a use statement, then the class loader will automatically look in that directory and load it, and we don't have to have those module.info files listing all of the now 50,000 different classes that are in Drupal core. So That's a little bit of a digression, but that's why we have namespaces in Drupal 8, so that we can have a bunch of different classes with the same name, which I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but we do. And B, because of the namespaces, that we don't have to use our own proprietary code class loader. We can use this one that's based on namespaces, which we adopted from Doctrine or wherever it was.
Namespaces are amazing. Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic.
Uh-oh. Lost my place here. Where were we? Here. Oh no, we hadn't gotten there yet. Okay. So anyway, that was a little bit of a digression about use statements and namespaces, but that's why we have them in Drupal 8. Which is more than you bargained for in this talk. Did you guys go to Larry's talk yesterday about the overview of Drupal 8 development? He probably talked about some of this stuff, but I think he had a whole hour to cover everything. Yeah, he can talk really fast. Okay, I didn't go to that talk, but I have seen it before. He can talk very fast. Okay, back to dependency injection. Yes, so you would have to have a use statement for this alias storage interface because you're using it in your class file, and Drupal has to know which namespace it's in order to locate it and automatically load that interface file. Okay, I mean, PHP has to know where it is. Did I say Drupal? PHP needs the use statement in order to use Drupal's inherited class loading thing to find it. Because PHP doesn't know our directory structure. So that's what that Doctrine class loader does, is it knows our directory structure and we can use the namespaces. Okay, questions? Okay, one more little digression about the namespaces. PHP itself does not care that files with a particular namespace go in a particular directory. PHP, you can put any old namespace declaration in any old file, and PHP does not care. The Doctrine class loader that we're using does care. So that's why we have to put our classes in particular directories, and then the class loader can find them. Okay.
Also, it just makes more sense.
It does make more sense, and it makes it easy if you know the namespace to find the class, or vice versa. And because it makes so much sense, it's a nice thing that we're using. Yeah. And we didn't have to write the class loader, which is good. Pretty sure it came from Doctrine. Anyway. Right. So, back to dependency injection. So we just saw how to inject dependent services in a service class. Now we're going to talk about injecting dependent services in a non-service class. So for instance, if you have a plugin class or just a page controller class that does something else in Drupal that isn't itself a service, you still might depend on services and you need to inject those as well. And the way you inject services in those type of classes is through either a create or a create instance method. And that depends. Create instance methods are kind of on factories, and create methods are on things like controllers. So a lot of these classes, like if you look at the base class for a page controller, do you guys know what a page controller is? We've done any Drupal 8 stuff yet. Anyway, page controllers are what are the page generating functions for generating any old page that your module creates, like your admin configuration page or something like that. So if you have a page controller, you're going to have, if your module puts a page up for Drupal, it needs to have a page controller class. And that page controller class will have a create method on it. The base class will have a create method on it. And you need to override that in order to inject the services that you need. And so the create method is called automatically when Drupal creates your page controller class, when it instantiates your page controller class, it's going to call this create method, which will then get stuff from the container and pass it into the constructor. So, in the service classes, we didn't need a create method because we had that services YAML file that was performing the same function. And in the non-service class, we have to do slightly more work to do the same thing. So basically, your create function is going to have one argument, which is going to be the container. And Drupal is going to automatically pass that in. And once you get the container, you are going to call, you're going to call your constructor and instantiate your class. It's kind of like a factory thing, if you're familiar with that standard object-oriented term. And you're going to instantiate your class, that's what the static means, is this class, and pass in the services that you need. So you're going to get the search page repository class and the logger class and you're going to pass them into your constructor. Oh, this is the controller from the search module. That's what this is. Yeah, so this is the controller class that puts up the admin page for the search module. And it needs to know, it has to find, there are things called search pages that you can define in Drupal 8. So it has to have this repository of search pages, and it does logging, so it has to get the logging, and then it passes those into the constructor function. Okay, so this works just like a YAML file, except the create function does the work of the YAML file by calling the get method on the container to get the services it needs. Okay? Questions?
So it doesn't instantiate your class, it just calls
It calls the create method.
create function, which has
Right.
to instantiate your class.
Right, it's not going to just call new Drupal search controller.
Okay.
It's going to, which would call the constructor function directly, it's going to call the create method, and the create method is going to call new and get the stuff and pass it in. Right, so basically, we're turning each of our classes, like controllers and plugins and things like that for Drupal 8, into factories by having this little create method on them. But they're very kind of simple factories that just know what they need, and they're able to get that from the container. Okay? So that's a little bit about factories. The services that are factories are one step removed from that in that they take other arguments for the create function, or the create instance function, because like the cache one is a good example of that, because when you do caching in Drupal, there's a default bin, and there's a different cache bins that say cache this type of data, cache that type of data, and the factory service for caching takes that bin name as one of its arguments. So it's not just taking the container, it's getting the cache bin, and so it will have a different service actually for each bin, and that's what that factory service does in the cache container. We can take a look at the class later if we have time. Back to your question. Okay. Any other questions on this? So I'm a believer in, when I went to graduate school, there was this guy named Wilkins in our department who had been there before I got there, but he had these Wilkins rules, and one of the rules was that when you're giving a talk, you should divide the amount of time you had for your talk by 10 minutes and have that many slides. So you're only supposed to have one slide every 10 minutes. So I'm a big believer of like putting something up and then talking about it for a long time. So if you get the slides later, you're going to find that they don't say anywhere near what I said. But they're just sort of a reminder, give you something to look at while I'm jabbering. I don't do the 10-minute rule. I think probably like 3 or 4 minutes is good, but I don't like to kind of flash through the slides either. So, okay. Any other questions? Good old Wilkins. Okay, so next topic is how would you discover what all the services are in Drupal? The easiest way, I think, I'm the maintainer of the API module that does api.drupal.org also, so this is my site. I really like api.drupal.org, and I've put in all kinds of new features for Drupal 8, so you should really go there and click on Drupal 8 and see what there is. The first thing is that if you go to api.drupal.org and click on the Drupal 8 link, you will find that there's a landing page there that has a list of topics that actually tell you what you need to learn about Drupal 8 development, and all of the topics are actually fairly accurate and trying to get you up to speed on Drupal 8 development. So you should definitely go there. I'm sorry about Drupal 7, but anyway, for Drupal 8, we've done a better job. And the reason for that is that almost 2 years ago at Bad Camp down in the Bay Area, I was there and Angie Byron was there, and we sat down and she said, you know, how are people going to figure out all of this new stuff in Drupal 8? Because there's so many new concepts. There's plugins, there's services, there's dependency injection, there's all this kind of thing. And she's like, how are people going to ever find this stuff? We have this area on Drupal.org documentation that nobody knows about, and we've got all this documentation there that's it was just getting started writing by then. But people go to api.drupal.org and they're just lost. There's like 50,000 classes and there's no way to figure this out. So we hatched this plan to revamp the topics and write little concise topics. They're not like great detail, but they give you at least the pointers to what you need to know. And so we hatched the plan, and I said, okay, I will write the topics if we can get like Tim Plunkett and those guys that actually know what the things do to review them, because I didn't know really what to write. And so I wrote all the topics, and Tim and Verdier, Sasha, reviewed them all and fixed all my problems, and then we committed them, and Angie committed them, and so we now actually have a good set of documentation there, so you should go there. Diversion, sorry. Don't click on topics, just go to the Drupal 8 landing page, which has an organized list of the topics that you actually need to read. The topics list lists all of them just like it does in Drupal 7. Anyway, if you go to api.drupal.org, this is actually the right sidebar, but you will find on the Drupal 8 page that there are new things on the sidebar that Drupal 7 didn't have, like namespaces. So you can actually see what all the namespaces are, and if you drill down to a namespace, it will show you all the classes in that namespace. And the other one that you will find is services. So if you click on services, you're going to get a list of all of the services in Drupal core. And there are also filters on there, so you can filter by name and you can filter by tag. They're little contains filters. So like if you want to look for the services that have something to do with caching, you can either filter by the name or the tag having cache in it, and you'll get the list down. And here are these I filtered on this screenshot by path. So you should definitely go there and kind of browse through the services, and it'll tell you what file the services are in, and it's kind of off the screen, but it will tell you what the class name is for that service, and you can click through to those and get documentation for those classes. And the file is the YAML file that it's in. So, and you'll notice here, this is an example of a YAML file that comes from a module. That's in the node module, and then these other three are all in the core, the really long core services file. The other thing that's kind of cool is if you actually click on a given service, and you can search for them in the search box as well, in Drupal 8, it'll have a little documentation about the service, and it just kind of basically lists what was in the YAML file. So, it's kind of helpful. So that's how you discover what the services are. You could also go and browse through all the services.yaml files yourself, but since the API module already parsed them for you, it might be better to go to api.drupal.org. And you can sort, if you wanted to do the browsing thing, you could actually go there, click on file, and sort the list by the file, as opposed to sorting by the name or the class or whatever. All of them. That's the other thing, that if you haven't gone to api.drupal.org, like all the listings now are views, and so they have filters and sorting and stuff like that. So it's kind of cool. That's been true for a while, but anyway. Okay, so let's talk about overriding a service. So this is the case where you are writing a module and you don't like the way core is doing something, and you want to do it in a different way for some reason. So here are the steps you need to follow to actually override a service. First thing is, you got to figure out what the service is. So you have to, go to api.drupal.org and find the YAML file for the service or whatever, and figure out what the default class is, and hopefully the interface. And then you're going to have to define a class that overrides that class, or implements the interface to do something in a different way. I mean, if you don't want to do that, you don't need to override the service. But presumably you want to have different methods in there that do something in a slightly different way from how core did it. And the easiest way is probably going to be to just override the class. So you're going to put this, if your module name is foobar, you're going to put this in your Drupal foobar namespace somewhere. Let's just say you called it my new service class. Okay? So that's how you're going to define what your version of the service does. And the rest of the steps are about telling Drupal to use your class instead of its own favorite class. Okay? So step 3 is you have to define a class that implements this interface called service modifier interface, and that's what allows you to alter the default classes that Drupal is going to use for services. And you have to name this class and put it in a namespace in a very, very specific way. You have to put it in your top-level foobar namespace for your module, so it's going to be directly in your module/source directory, and it must be named foobar service provider, where foobar is the camel case version of your module's machine name, and it must be named this exact thing, or Drupal will not find it. It's one of those very rare magic things in Drupal. Most of the time, Drupal doesn't really care what things are named, but in this case, you actually have to name it that exact thing, because it will not find your class otherwise. It's not enough to just implement the interface and put it wherever you want to, or name the class whatever you want to. You have to do it exactly like this. Don't ask. Anyway, and then in the alter method, which is the one method that's in this modifier interface, you're going to, it passes in the container, and you're going to do something like this, where you're going to find the definition for the service that you wanted to override, and then you're going to just set the class to be your class instead of the one that it wanted to do. And there are other alterations you can do. So you can look up what a service definition has. It's got all those things that are in the YAML file, like the arguments and all of that stuff. So in principle, you could alter the arguments or something else. You probably wouldn't want to, but you could. The main thing you're going to want to do is just set it to be a new class. Yeah. Take a picture of the slide. But that's how you do it. So you have to define a class with this particular name, and then in the class, there's just this one method, and it's 10 lines of code. Yep.
So how does that namespace reflect in the file structure?
Okay, so within a module, let me escape out of here for a moment. Within a module, so if I'm in the, I'll just go into the node module as an example. If I can type. Okay, so each module, so if you're in the node module, each module has a source directory underneath it. And so within this directory, all of the classes within this directory have a namespace of Drupal/node. Okay, so within your foobar module, the source directory, all of the classes in there have a namespace of Drupal/foobar. And then you can have subdirectories, so if you're in the test directory, the test subdirectory under node, and you look at, let's see what we have.
So for the one that you're writing to override, though, it's not in the core, it just gets the modules directory. So just kind of ignore that core part and the modules part, I guess.
Right. Yeah. So this file's namespace is Drupal node tests, and where it is in Drupal core modules node source tests. So that magic class loader business, when you're in a module directory, it ignores everything up to here and the source directory. And so if you're in this directory source, your namespace is Drupal node and then whatever the subdirectories are underneath there. Yeah, that's the magic class loader part for modules. Yeah, so if you're doing your foobar module and you put something in, yours is not going to be under Drupal core modules. Yours is going to be under sites all modules or just the top level modules directory. But within your module directory, you're going to have a source directory, and anything under there is automatically got to be in namespace Drupal foobar. Okay? Questions? Somebody's pinging me. I'm ignoring them. Okay. Oops. Let me see what. Maybe I can get to the right page this time. Oops. Where were we? Oh, no, this one. Oh, it didn't do that. That's okay, I don't have too many slides. Okay, this is where we were, overriding a service. So, yeah, so you're going to put that, if your namespace is Drupal foobar, and this is at the top level, it's just going to go under your foobar module in directory source without a subdirectory. Okay?
Are there any examples in core that do this? Or it would just be, does it just be
yeah, so we should look in core for service modifier interface. Let's do that. Wait a minute, let me see if I have another slide. Oh, yes, shameless plug, that's it. That's really all I have to say. I have written a book on Drupal 8 module development. So I have the Programmer's Guide to Drupal. Drupal 7 version was the first edition. The Drupal 8 version is in kind of a rough draft format on O'Reilly. And it's probably going to come out in final version in September-ish, late August, September. So I will just have a shameless plug that if you want to learn all about Drupal 8 development, you should get this book. And it also has Drupal 7 and 8 in it, so if you're familiar with Drupal 7 things, you can see kind of how to do parallel things in Drupal 8. So anyway, that's the end of my talk. So let's go ahead and look at, sorry, I have to put my glasses on. This is the problem with getting old. Okay. So api.drupal.org. Let's look at Drupal 8. And then it was the service modifier interface. Oh, let me see if I can just do this.
The migrate service provider.
Okay, look, so this is another thing on, if you haven't looked at api.drupal.org, it's kind of cool. So if you go to the service modifier interface alter, it tells us that 6 methods override this. Some of these are tests. Let's look at the installer one. That looks kind of cool. So this method here, it's doing all kinds of things. It's setting a parameter for that method, and it's clearing some other tag. That's kind of weird. Let's not look at that one. Let's see what Hal does. Yeah, well anyway, if you look at these 6 methods that override the service modifier interface : alter, you can see some examples of that in core. So.
Can you show the slide again that says what?
Oh, probably. Well, I'm not very good at this PowerPoint type thing, although it's not even PowerPoint. Yeah, that's the slide. So they're doing slightly different things with that alter method, but yeah. I think there might be one in the language module that overrides how some of the string translation stuff is doing things. Okay. Any other questions? You want to talk? Did you get your questions answered about the factory stuff, or do you want to look at that a little bit more?
How does order resolution of this process get resolved?
What's that?
How do conflicts of this process get resolved? If there's more than one.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but we could. Did I put a note in here? I remember in my book when I described this that I actually figured out why this class name had to be this way, and found the method that actually did this stuff, but I don't know what it is offhand. I could pull up the chapter in my book and figure that out. I imagine it's probably going in the weight order of modules like Hooks did, but I'm not actually sure about that, but I think it probably is. Because this is a Drupal thing, not a Symfony thing to do this, to look for these particular names. So I think it was a Drupal class that did this. So yeah, I think it's going, because it's looking in modules. Modules are a Drupal thing, not a Symfony thing. So yeah, the class that's doing this is looking through the modules. It's probably going in module weight order, but I'm not absolutely positive about that. Yeah, yeah. So it might let the core service, the core system module do its thing first, and then some other module. But as you saw there weren't that many classes that are actually doing this in core. But if you had contrib modules, it's not that common of a thing to need to do. But yeah.
Service provider test, service provider test. Right?
Yeah, service provider test, service provider test.
Because it has to test that this works. Right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So if a developer didn't really know anything about Drupal,
Yes.
and they saw a .services.yaml file in a folder and said, look, why don't I just create my service within that service.yaml file, the same name of an existing service in Drupal?
I believe Drupal would crash.
Okay.
If when it either wouldn't let you install the module or it wouldn't run after you installed it.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think you can have two modules defining the same service name.
Okay.
Yeah. Good question. Yeah, that's not the way to override it. You need to do the alter thing.
Anticipating I'm going to allow that.
Yeah, you might. Yeah, you need to make sure, if you define a service yourself for your module that's not related to a core service, then you should just name it with a foobar prefix, your module name prefix. Yeah.
There's not namespaces for services.
What's that?
There's not namespaces for services.
No, but there's kind of a convention to put dots in them, like cache dot something and foobar dot something for your services.
And if you're creating
Or underscores, kind of take your pick. Just make it a mishmash just like everything else.
And if you're creating a service within your module, then a new one,
Yeah.
then that goes into a services.yaml.
Right. So if you look at, let's see. I don't think the node module has any. Oh, it does. There is a node.services.yaml file here. That's an example of one from the node module. And if we look at it, yeah. Oh, that's right. There's a node. There are actually quite a lot of services in the node module. So those, and you'll notice they're all called node. Well, not all of them. Most of them are called node dot something. This one's called access check dot node dot whatever because it's an access check service. But yes.
What are the purposes of the tag?
The tags are used to group services together. So, like these access check services are gathered by the access checking part of Drupal. So there's a way for Drupal core to actually say, find me all the services that have this tag, and then it can do something appropriate so that when it's trying to do some kind of access checking, it will collect all the services. It's called a service collector, strangely enough, but it will collect together all the services with a certain tag and then do something with them. And the cache service is a good example of that, the overall caching service, because in that cache, the factory that generates that tries to find the right service for a particular cache bin, all of the caching services are, let me show you this. I think we have time. Services. Oops. Anyway, so all the services that are called cache that have a tag of cache.bin, I forgot what the tag was. All of these services, like cache.bootstrap config, these are for caching different types of data. There's a default one that's for generic data, and then there are all these different, there's an entity cache that's separate, a menu cache that's separate. So those are those things like if you do drush cc, you can clear just part of your cache. So you can clear the menu cache or the entity cache.
So you can programmatically go and ask for all the cache.bins and then check each one to see which one is the appropriate one.
Yeah, in principle you could. Right. The cache factory kind of, if somebody asks for a cache bin of a certain type, it'll at least check and see if there's a service for it, and use that tag to collect all the services that exist. And also, it also does that when it's trying to clear all the caches, because cache clear all has to ask each of the services to clear itself in its own particular way, because there's a clear method on the cache service. So. The overall caching service has to say, or some function that clears all the caches has to say, find me all of those cache bin services and call this clear method on each one. So that's a good example of why you need a tag for that. Because otherwise they're just like, you'd have to say like, well, find all the services that have this particular name, and that wouldn't really work, so that's why the tags exist. So you can say, find all the services that are tagged cache.bin and call clear on all of them. That's a really good use case for it.
Is there a location of all the tags that Drupal knows?
No, that's a feature request in the API module right now, but it doesn't exist right now. Yeah.
So.
And the problem. Oh, sorry. The problem is some services actually have more than one tag. So this column isn't even sortable because the tags can be multiple tags. Anyway, yeah.
So to have this straight in my head, we have services, and there's a dependency injection container, which is the list of all the services,
Yep.
core services YAML, modules, core
The enabled modules.
services
Any
YAML,
enabled modules YAML. Yep.
and any contrib module services YAML.
Yep.
Is like the
Any
master
enabled
list.
modules, just the enabled ones. Right.
Right.
Yep.
And then when you are creating your own class, then in the construct method, you're putting those services that your class depends upon
Right.
in there.
And you're going to get them either from the create, or if your class is a service, from the arguments in the YAML file.
Okay.
Right.
And so if it's not a service, then you're putting it into your class so
Into your
that
create.
you can use that stuff, and the stuff that you're using, the services that you're using, they're internally getting all of their dependencies.
That's right.
They need to do their thing within your
Exactly.
class.
So it makes it, the reason that you want to do this, or why Drupal wanted to do this, and we're kind of out of time, but the reason is that you can have all of these different services, but they're now in small chunks. And so if module X wants to do something a little differently, they can define which part of that process they wanted to override, and just override 1 or 2 services rather than having to like rewrite all of path stuff. You know, they can just do one thing that just affects external paths or something. So.
And hopefully this allows us to be very productive in the 8.x minor revision rounds. You might find like the whole class could be replaced.
Right, yeah, exactly.
A compatibility layer.
Right, and because nobody's instantiating these classes directly, hopefully, they shouldn't be, then you should be okay in that, you know, if you replace one class and do something slightly differently, as long as it maintains the same interface, you know, it should be okay, and all of the other services and classes and stuff that depend on that service should still work. So, yeah. All right, I think we're out of time. I think there's a break or lunch or something now.
One quick thing.
Yes?
So pretty much all of the API to access anything else, you're supposed to go through the services.
To access anything else? Well, there's also plugins, which are a whole other thing.
Right, but
Yeah.
to access.
Of course, plugin managers are services also, but anyway.
But to access the core functionality, like, the API roughly is just now composed of exclusively services.
A lot of it is. Almost all of it is. And for certain functions like T, the translate function still exists, but it even calls a service now. So yeah, there are very, very few things in core that are still just a procedural function and aren't using some kind of service. And the idea was you could, in principle, you could replace out any of it, swap out any of it. Yeah.
So instead of the hook method where you're just replacing a hook with your...
There's still hooks.
There's still hooks?
Yes,
Okay.
there are still
So it's
hooks.
kind of like that, right? Where you're
Well, it's a different
basically-
way of altering
Right.
Drupal, yeah.
Yeah.
Right, and the plugins are another way, which I have another talk on, but not here.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So, okay. Thanks for coming.